Hello and welcome to this presentation on child maltreatment. Today we'll be sharing some information on things that we all should know. Every year, nearly 1 million cases of child maltreatment, which include both abuse and neglect, are confirmed, and many more probably go unreported. Maltreatment has a long-term impact on the affected child and also carries heavy costs for families and communities and society as a whole. This presentation is designed to give you, the child care professionals, the tools to prevent, identify, and report child abuse and neglect among the children in your care. Did you know that a report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds in the United States? Yearly referrals to state child protective services involve 6.6 million children, and around 3.2 million of those children are subject to investigated reports. In 2014 alone, state agencies found over 702,000 children victims of child maltreatment. But that only tells part of the story. All I can imagine is that this would pack 10 modern football stadiums. A child is killed of abuse or neglect every 5.5 hours. Child maltreatment tells a shocking story of abuse and neglect in the United States. The welfare of children in the United States could certainly be much better. Over 70 million children in the United States, one is killed every 5.5 hours due to abuse or neglect. In other words, imagine 4 children die as a result of maltreatment every single day. More than 3 million children receive treatment for abuse each year. Child abuse facts show us that 10% of the children in America suffer from maltreatment. There is no strong difference, however, between the statistics for boys or girls as far as occurrence. Roughly 48% of the children abused are boys, and 51% of the children abused are girls. Sadly, though, child abuse tells us that boys are more likely than girls to die from child abuse. More than 50% of the children who die from child abuse are boys. 70% of the children who die from abuse are under 3 years of age. Some of the saddest child abuse facts tell us that younger children are more likely to be abused. Child abuse facts show that children in their first year of life are most likely to be victims of child abuse. Children living in poverty experience more abuse and neglect. Experienced poverty can place a lot of stress on families, which may increase the risk of child abuse and neglect. Rates of child abuse and neglect are 5 times higher for children in families with low socioeconomic status compared to children in families with higher socioeconomic status. 15.3% of children suffering from child abuse have a disability. Child abuse facts tell us that there are certain risk factors which are more likely that a child will be abused. Statistics show that 13.3% of child abuse victims have some sort of disability. Mothers abuse children twice as much as fathers. Child abuse paints an interesting or surprising picture when it comes to which parent is most likely to abuse a child. The common image is of an angry father does not match with the statistics. 36.6% of the cases of child abuse are committed by the mother acting alone. The percentage of child abuse committed by the father acting alone is 18.7%. When both parents are involved, it's 19.4%. and 12% of the cases are committed by someone who is not the child's parents. 60% of the children sexually abused are abused by people the child trusts. Child sexual abusers are most likely to be people that the families know and could even care about. Most abusers are fathers, step-parents, grandparents, and other family members. Even older children and peers can abuse the children. Offenders may also be neighbors, babysitters, ministers, teachers, coaches, or anyone else who has close contact with children. Up to 80% of all cases included in sexual offenders is someone that the child knows and trusts. Child abuse and neglect can have a negative impact on lifelong health and well-being. Not only do children suffer immediate physical injuries or emotional problems or lacking of social emotional skills and having anxiety, it also has a tremendous impact on their lifelong health, opportunities, and well-being. For example, exposure to violence in childhood increases the risk of injury, further violence, substance abuse, sexually transmitted infections, delayed brain development, lower educational attainment, and limited employment opportunities. In sum, child abuse paints a troubling picture for children in the United States. Maltreatment is the second leading cause of death behind sudden infant death syndrome from children ages 0 to 5. 4 children die every year as a result of child abuse. Perhaps surprising to some, mothers are most often the perpetrators. In over 36% of the child abuse cases, the mother acted alone in abusing the child. Children with disabilities and medical conditions are at particular risk for abuse. As a community, we should do more to watch out for signs of maltreatment. Parents are responsible for child maltreatment in more than 80% of the cases. Another one of the surprising child maltreatment facts is that children under the age of 3 years old are most likely to be abused. Children that we take care of. Special care should be taken to prevent abuse and neglect in the earlier years of a child's life when they are most vulnerable. So you ask, why do we have to have child abuse training again? The main reason, of course, is that it is a federal and state training requirement of all Head Start and Early Head Start staff. It is listed in your Head Start performance standards, mainly in HSPC 1302.90 on personnel policies, and also on HSPC 1302.92 on training and professional development. It is also listed in your Texas Child Care Licensing Minimum Standards, where it talks about the requirements for discipline and guidance, and also the requirements for training and professional development. And here's where it specifically states that at least 1 hour of annual training hours must focus on prevention, recognition, and reporting of child maltreatment, which includes the factors indicating a child is at risk of abuse or neglect, warning signs indicating a child may be a victim of abuse or neglect, procedures for reporting child abuse or neglect, and community organizations that have a training program available to employees, children, and parents. not only because it's in your Head Start performance standards, and that it is also in your Texas Child Care Minimum Standards, it's because it's a good idea. You can make a positive impact in young children's lives. So for the agenda, we will be going over the types of child abuse and neglect, the risk factors and indicators that a child may be a victim of abuse and neglect, procedures for reporting child abuse or neglect, and then looking at community programs that have training available for employees, children, and parents. While looking at the victim profiles, these are current traits that you'll see. First, it's usually a child from birth to 3 years of age. Facilities are higher among boys. Children may appear to be withdrawn and often sleepy. More cases are higher among American Indians. They tend to live with non-biological adults. They demonstrate inappropriate behavior, and they lack of medical and dental care. An offender's profile have these common characteristics. First, an offender is often have their own history of being abused. They are a single parent or a family friend. They may be experiencing their own mental health problems. They lack in their knowledge of parenting skills and child development. They may have a history of substance abuse. There may be environmental stress factors, financing, housing. They also may tend to have a lack of anger management. There are 4 categories of maltreatment: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. And while many think that we will see the most cases under physical abuse, it is actually neglect that is the #1 form of child abuse. Neglect is a failure to meet children's basic needs, such as the need for food, water, clothing, shelter, protection, education, and health care. There is physical neglect, medical neglect, inadequate supervision, environmental neglect, emotional neglect, educational neglect, and in newborns there is also an addiction or an exposure to drugs. You may see parents withholding food, leaving a child unsupervised for an unreasonable amount of time, given the child's age and capabilities, leaving a child under 5 years old in a vehicle for more than 5 minutes without someone at least 14 years of older supervising the child, refusing relief services which are necessary in order to provide for the child's basic needs, failing to address a severe pest infestation in home that can lead to harm for the child, and refusing to take the child to the doctor when the child has a serious medical need. Physical indicators of neglect are consistent hunger, poor hygiene, inappropriate dress, consistent lack of supervision, especially in dangerous activities or long periods, constant fatigue or listlessness, unattended physical problems or medical needs, abandonment, or physical indicators of neglect include begging, stealing food, extended stays at school, early arrival and late departure, constantly falling asleep in class, maybe even an alcohol or drug abuse, delinquencies, and states to you that there's no one taking care of him, no care provider. Physical abuse results in physical injury that results in substantial harm to the child or the genuine threat of substantial harm from physical injury to the child. Failure to make a reasonable effort to prevent an action by another person that results in physical injury or substantial harm to the child. The current use by a person of controlled substance in a manner or to the extent that the use results in physical, mental, or emotional injury to a child, or causing, expressively permitting, or encouraging a child to use a controlled substance. Physical abuse indicators might be unexplained bruises and welts, unexplained burns, unexplained fractures, unexplained lacerations and abrasions. With our particular age group, it's even more difficult to detect physical abuse indicators because children may not be able to verbalize where they've been hurt. But some behavioral indicators of physical abuse may be weary of adult contact or apprehensiveness when other children cry. Behavioral extremes may include aggressiveness, withdrawal, frightened of parents or other adults, afraid to go home. And this is different from when they cry because they don't want to go home because they want to stay to play. But this is general fear of going home, or even they themselves may be reporting injuries by a parent. So in some, physical abuse can include any force that causes a child bodily injury, such as striking, kicking, shaking, burning, pushing, biting, cutting, binding, gagging, handling, throwing, or choking a child, holding a child underwater, or twisting a child's limbs. Next, let's look at emotional abuse. This type of abuse is mental or emotional injury to a child that results in an observable and material impairment in a child's growth, development, or psychological functioning. It's causing or permitting a child to be in a situation in which a child sustains a mental or an emotional injury that results also in an observable or material impairment in the child's growth, development, or psychological functioning. Emotional abuse can include ignoring, withholding love or affection, only giving attention for bad behavior, name calling, screaming, using sarcasm or a disrespectful tone, referring to a child as it, describing a child as bad or stupid or worthless or evil. Even perhaps, I want to add, describing a child as acting like a baby. Constantly blaming, belittling, or criticizing a child. Terrorizing. Having unpredictable expectations and reactions that leave the child guessing how to behave. People that are working with children in the classrooms, I really want you to focus on these types of indicators of emotional abuse. Be careful about only giving attention for children's bad behavior. Be careful about calling them names or using sarcastic or disrespectful tones or describing a behavior as bad or acting as a baby or terrorizing a child and saying that if they don't do something, you're going to put them in the baby room. Because these are very close to be considered emotional abuse. Indicators of that may seem that you'll see children have a habit disorder, such as sucking, biting, or rocking. Conducting disorders such as being antisocial or destructive. Or neurotic traits, sleeping disorders, speech disorders, inhibition of play. Behavioral indicators of emotional abuse. Inappropriately behavior toward adults or inappropriate infant behavior. They start acting childlike. Or you may see behavioral extremes where they're very compliant and passive, very obeying, overly obeying. Or you may see them become aggressive and demanding. Emotional abuse is very hard to detect, but it becomes very obvious if you look at their behaviors and their causes for behavior. Now let's touch on sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is any sexual act that is intended to arouse the abuser, and particularly any sexual activity a child cannot understand or consent to. When we consider child abuse or sexual abuse, we need to see sexual conduct harmful. That is, indicators are sexual conduct harmful to a child's mental, emotional, or physical welfare, including conduct that constitutes the offense of indecency with a child, sexual assaults, or aggravated sexual assaults. Another is failure to make a reasonable effort to prevent sexual conduct harmful to a child. Compelling or encouraging a child to engage in sexual conduct. Causing, permitting, encouraging, engaging in, or allowing the photography, filming, or depicting of a child if the person knew or should have known the resulting photograph, film, or depiction of the child is obscene and pornographic. And causing, permitting, encouraging in, or allowing a sexual performance by a child. Physical indicators of sexual abuse is often difficulty walking or sitting, torn, stained, or bloody underclothing, pain or itching in the genital area, bruises or bleeding in the external genitalia, vaginal or anal areas, venereal disease, especially in preteens, and pregnancy. Yes, in our population, we're probably not going to see, the pregnancy, but there are the other indicators have been visible for young children. Physical indicators of sexual abuse include a withdrawal to change, for gym or participate in PE, withdrawn fantasy or infantile behavior, bizarre, sophisticated, or unusual sexual behavior or knowledge, poor peer-to-peer relationships, and delinquent or runaway, or perhaps the most noted is they report sexual assault by caregivers. So let's go back. There are 4 categories of maltreatment: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. Do you remember which category had the highest percentage of cases? Correct. Neglect. So remember, there's physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. Now I'd like to touch on some particular types of abuse that I just want to, bring out to attention. And first is shaken baby syndrome, because it is a form of physical child abuse that results from violent shaking of an infant. Newborns to 1 year old are the greatest risk of injury from this shaking. And the number one reason for shaking is frustrated parents with babies crying. And the effects of shaken baby syndrome are severe and long-lasting to the child's development. Another type of abuse is called the Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And this is where a parent or a caregiver would serve as the proxy, fabricate or make up symptoms of illness in a child they're caring for. They may cause a symptom through either poisoning, through medication, or suffocation of the child. And the proxy has a history of seeking treatment at numerous medical facilities for the child. Probably because they're not hearing what they want to hear, and they're going to find out where it is where they'll find a place where they will agree with what they're seeing. And usually the parent or the caregiver that's a proxy has very good knowledge of medical terms, illness, and procedures. Another type of abuse is human trafficking or exploitations. You have the sex trafficking, the labor trafficking, and the organ theft and forced marriage. And more and more, I read about these cases in newspapers and hear about them on TV, and so I thought I would bring this up. So now we're here at how do we report such maltreatment? And that's the question, how do we report child maltreatment in Texas? First, you need to know that Texas law requires that any person suspecting that a child has been abused or neglected must immediately make a report. Okay, and this is not that you know for sure. It says suspecting. So by law, we are required to report any suspicion of child abuse or neglect. If you suspect that there's an emergency, you need to call 911 and then call the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services at their Texas Abuse Hotline at the toll-free 24-hour, 7 days a week by phone at 1-800-252-5400. Let me repeat. This is a toll-free. That means it doesn't cost you anything. It's 24 hours. It's open every day, every week, all hours. The phone is 1-800-252-5400 or on a secure website at www.txabusehotline.org. So again, if you suspect and you believe it is an emergency, that you believe they're in grave threat, you can call 911 and then call the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services on their Texas Abuse Hotline at 1-800-252-5400 or on their secure website at www.txabusehotline.org. So even if you're not sure, you need to report it. And your report initially can be anonymous. You do not have to leave a name. You need to provide as much detail as possible to make it easier for them to detect the severeness of the abuse or neglect. You will be asked who is involved, what happened, and safety concerns. Even if you don't have all the information, whatever details you can provide will be helpful. While your identity is confidential, it may be required to release your identity should charges need to be pressed. That is why I urge all teachers and staff at the centers that it is important to conduct the intake daily health checks. And the reason for that is that if they come with a bruise and you see it, then you can ask the question there. But if they leave your center with a bruise, then it could be that they would suspect that you're the one that caused the bruise. When you do report, you are protected from civil and criminal liability. But if you fail to report, you may be subject to criminal charges. Another thing that we need to share is that you are subject to liability for knowingly filing a false report. So the last thing in the agenda is that we need to share community resources available for families and training in our area. And the first resource that I was able to find was Cameron County Child Protective, which is located at 1060 McIntosh Drive in Brownsville. Their phone number is 546-5591. Another resource is the Cameron County Child Advocacy Center. Their address is 1390 West Expressway 83 in San Benito. Their phone number is 956-361-3313. Another member of our team is the Cameron County Child Support Office. Their number is 974 East Harrison Street, Brownsville, and their phone number is 956-544-0840. The last resource that I was able to find is the Buckner Children's and Family Services, and they are located at 1713 East Tyler Avenue in Harlingen, and their phone number is 956-423-7909. This is our team. These are people that you may be able to contact for community resources for families and training in our area. So we go back to why do we have child abuse training? And remember, it is a federal requirement. It is also a state requirement, but also that it's a good idea. I'd like to share a little story I heard a few weeks ago. And it was about it's a man already working with Head Start. And he was sharing that he was a Head Start child himself. And that when he was young, his parents came into the United States from Mexico. And his mother became a Head Start cook. And it was very normal in their family that when they got in trouble, they got spanked with a belt or spanked with a chancla. And he said that one day his mother came home and she told her husband that they no longer were going to spank their children with a belt or hit them with a chancla for misbehaving, because she did not want her children to remember her like that. So not only is child abuse training good for you in the classroom, but it's also good to maybe in our own homes. And so that's why we encourage you not only to have child abuse training for you all, but also for you to have child abuse training for your parents. Now, as we go back to the agenda, let's kind of summarize what we've talked about. First of all, there's 4 types of child abuse: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. With neglect being the leading category of cases that we've heard. Also, you need to be familiar with what risk factors or indicators that a child may be a victim of abuse and neglect. Remember, any type of physical or unexplained physical injury, children being withdrawn, inappropriate behavior, whether it be they're very passive or they're very aggressive, fear of adults, any bleeding, young children. These are types of risk factors or indicators. Procedures for reporting child abuse and neglect. Remember, even if you suspect, if you believe it's an emergency, you call 911 and then follow up with a report to the Texas Family and Protective Services at their hotline phone number or website. And know about the community programs that you have available in your area for training for employees, children, and parents. And I shared 4 of those programs in our area.
Let's take a moment to talk about a very serious topic called child abuse and neglect. A subject none of us really want to talk about, but is vitally important, especially if you work in an industry where you might be mandated to report such abuse or neglect. First though, let's cover a little bit of background about this subject. According to the statistics covered by the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the Administration for Children and Families, an estimated 679,000 children were victims of abuse and neglect, and of those, over 1,500 died in 2013 alone. Of these children, 80% suffered from neglect, 18% suffered a physical form of abuse, and 9% were victims of sexual abuse. So as you can clearly see, this is a problem that is so serious and far too common. My hope is that this training will give you the knowledge to recognize true abuse and neglect and help you protect the innocent. Now, depending on your state laws, you may have a legal requirement to report suspected abuse as a person called a mandated reporter. A mandated reporter is a person who is legally required to ensure that a report is made to the proper authorities when abuse is observed or suspected. Specific details vary across states and jurisdictions, so make sure you know your particular details. Abuse that must be reported typically includes that which can be categorized as neglect, physical, or sexual in nature. Mandated reporters may be paid staff or volunteers, but who have assumed full or even limited responsibility for the care of a child. And this often includes, but not limited to, teachers, daycare providers, EMS personnel, coaches, camp staff, and other professionals. Unfortunately, abuse can occur anywhere, and some examples might include like child daycare centers, schools, religious institutions, recreational and athletic programs, camps, residential facilities, and sadly, even at home. The most predominant type of abuse is neglect. Neglect is something that means despite available resources, the parent or legal caregiver fails to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, supervision, and may not seek appropriate medical attention for illness or injury. Now, this can happen for a number of reasons, but may specifically include a family crisis or a job loss, a serious illness to a caregiver, or a divorce or separation of parents. And that all leads to causing chaos in a household that also alters the structure or routines, or the home may seem that it has little space left over for the child. Now, indicators of neglect may include a child who looks undernourished and hungry. Now, these children might even become beggars for food because of this persistent hunger. The child might be more lethargic, like they're not getting enough sleep due to disrupted schedules. They've got noticeably poor hygiene. Maybe they're inappropriately dressed for the weather. The child may have injuries that can be attributed to a lack of supervision, including those kind of associated from being harmed by other people. The trigger that makes them suspect of abuse is that they say they have frequent accidents and injuries. Along with these injuries, they have a poor ability to relate to others and have poor self-esteem. Maybe they have attachment difficulties or other social problems like their inability to say no to inappropriate requests. These are all different ways we can suspect neglect and recognize that there may be a problem. Now, unlike neglect, physical abuse is any act that, regardless of the intent, results in a non-accidental physical injury to a child. It can happen as a result of a parent becoming frustrated or angry and striking, shaking, or even throwing a child. Physical abuse may be an intentional, deliberate assault, such as burning, biting, or cutting the child. It's vital to remember that all children get bumps and bruises and cuts, but it's important to recognize when those bumps and bruises may be the indication that there's physical abuse rather than just normal childhood accidents. In all cases, consider the context. Take into account the child's explanation of the injury, the child's age, and the overall behavior that you notice in that child. Now let's take a closer look at some of the specific signs of physical abuse, like questionable bruises and welts or other injuries on the face or around their lips and mouth. Cuts and bruises on the torso or on the back, buttocks, and thighs in various stages of healing. In other words, the bruises might be different colors, like some are red and purple and others are more yellowish green. The bruises reflect the shape of the object used to inflict the injury, like an electrical cord or a belt buckle. For the questionable burns like cigarette burns, especially on the soles of the feet or palms of the hands, the back, or even the buttocks of the children. You may see signs of something we call immersion burns. This could be like sock-like burns where we've seen they've put the baby or child into hot water. Now, donut-shaped burns on the buttocks or genitalia, or burn patterns that are like electric stove burners, where they're round and circular or look like the surface of an iron. Maybe some rope burns on arms and legs or neck or torso. Look for fractures to the skull, the nose, the face, and black eyes, all in various stages of healing. These could all indicate signs of physical abuse. So let's look at behavioral indicators now. Some behavioral indications might be that the child is uncomfortable with physical contact, being wary of adults, and being apprehensive when other children cry. They may show emotional extremes like being overly aggressive or extremely withdrawn. In some cases, the child may be frightened of the parents and afraid to go home. They may arrive to school very early or stay very late. Again, all possible indicators that the child is avoiding the need to go home. Look for a track record where the child has made repetitive attempts to run away from home. So be alert to these reports that the child is being hurt by a parent or someone at home or in their community, and maybe they're even complaining of body limb soreness or moving uncomfortably. Maybe the child is wearing clothing inappropriate to the weather. I liken this to, say, a big, bulky shirt and loose pants in order to cover the body or the wounds. Additionally, they may even be reluctant to change clothes in public or for gym activities. This again being an attempt to hide injuries or bruises as a result of the abuse. So how do you tell the difference between normal discipline and abuse? Well, it's important that there be some objective guidelines between corporal punishment and abuse. Corporal punishment, which is allowed in some areas of the United States, such as spanking, may be used as a discipline technique by parents or guardians to teach appropriate behavior. Discipline is a learning process, though. The goal is to teach appropriate behavior. Abuse, on the other hand, is not a learning process where the goal is not to stop inappropriate behavior, but to inflict pain, and is usually the result of anger, loss of control, and frustration. See, there's a difference between accidents and purposeful injury. But how does one tell the difference between abuse and accidental injury? Well, abuse and accidental injury can look similar, but there are important differences, and they are that cuts and bruises caused by accidents normally occur in outside areas of the body, like the elbows and the knees, but accidental injuries to soft tissue areas like the stomach and the buttocks are way less likely. Now, if the same type of injury happens frequently, it's less likely to be an accident unless it's in a location that's socially acceptable for the appropriate age and activity level of the child. If multiple injuries are present, especially in different stages of healing, it's less likely to be an accident unless the child's involved in a full contact sport. If a series of injuries appear in a pattern or resemble an object like an electric cord or a wooden spoon, well, that's very suspicious, and it may have been inflicted by abuse. If a child's caregiver gives an explanation for injuries that's not consistent with the facts, then the injury may be suspect. Sometimes examples can be helpful, so here's a couple. Steve, a 10-year-old boy, arrived at school with a bruise on his elbow and a scrape on his knee. And so you ask him what happened, and Steve says, "Well, I got hurt riding my bike when I hit a curb. I fell on the road." He says his father gave him a spanking because he told him not to ride on the road. Now, Steve's father states the same exact thing when he picks up Steve from the school, and Steve was glad to see his dad. In this situation, abuse would not be suspected. See, Steve's injuries are consistent with his explanation. His father's explanation was the same, and his injuries are on the outer bony areas of the body, not the soft inner tissues. Steve behaved normally with his father and had no bruises or injuries from the corporal punishment, again indicating this was probably not abuse. Now here's the second one. You notice that Susie, a 9-year-old, is trying to hide from the other girls in the locker room when she changes into her gym t-shirt. You notice that she has bruises on her upper arms and back, as well as a strap welt and bruises on her lower back in various stages of healing. When you question her about it, she says, well, I fell down the stairs, and she's really afraid that you might ask her mother about it. You see, in this situation, you should suspect abuse. Susie's secrecy, her fear of her mother being called, and the bruises on her upper arms and back, the specific injury pattern, and the evidence of the various stages of healing are all multiple indicators of possible abuse. Remember, reporting suspected abuse is helping to protect those who are being abused. Now let's talk about sexual abuse. It's a complex type of abuse with significant implications for the child victim. Often there are no physical signs or behavioral indicators that can be seen, or they're subtle and attributed to other things. But the adult abuser usually tries to manipulate them into silence by using things like, "This is our little secret," with real or implied threats. See, this type of manipulation is far beyond the child's ability to understand. This is emotionally confusing to the child and will often create a wide range of emotional responses. Sexual abuse can be defined as any illegal sexual act upon a child, and it includes incest, rape, indecent exposure, fondling, child prostitution, and child pornography. Indicators of child sexual abuse include inappropriate knowledge of sex or sex behaviors, sexually explicit drawings, or highly sexualized play. Maybe expressions of unexplained fear of a person or place, avoiding or attempting to avoid a familiar adult. They also include nightmares, sleep interruptions, withdrawal, guilt-like feelings like, "It's my fault." They may also indicate shame. They may have serious depression or maybe depression in general, anxiety, or mood swings. Make no mistake, one of the strongest indicators of sexual abuse is when a child simply says that he or she has been sexually abused. Take the statement seriously. Resolve doubt in favor of the child and err on the side of protection. If it's not truly abuse, a good justice system will find that out. So how should you respond to the abuse? Abusers often tell children that bad things are going to happen if they tell others about it, or that it's a secret that is not to be shared. Because of this, children are more likely to share information in an indirect way, hoping you'll just figure it out and figure out what they're trying to tell you. There are different forms of disclosure. Let's cover a few. Like indirect. Indirect disclosure might sound like this: "My babysitter keeps bothering me." There's also disguised disclosure. Disguised disclosure sounds like, "What would happen if a girl was being touched in a bad way and she told someone about it?" A disclosure with strings attached might be something like, "I have a problem, but if I tell you about it, you have to promise not to tell anybody." So if a child wants to tell you something, listen to them, but remain calm. Encourage the child to tell you what happened, but please don't press the child beyond that which they're willing to provide. It's important not to promise that you won't tell anyone else either. Let the child know that you may need to tell someone else in order to help them. Remember, you're not responsible to prove that the abuse or neglect occurred, just that you have a suspicion that a child is being abused or neglected. If you have a reason to suspect abuse has occurred, then report the situation to a local Child Protective Service office. And if you're a mandated reporter, you have a legal responsibility to report. There may be a policy that governs who actually makes a report to Child Protective Services when abuse is suspected. It's important that you know your reporting policies and procedures. Please, don't shirk your responsibilities, and please don't overestimate the strength and power of a healthy relationship that is simply good discipline and training. It's going to take discernment and wisdom on your part, but when you do suspect true abuse because of multiple indicators, you're acting on the part of a true rescuer for a child who may be in serious danger.
In summary, there are 4 types or categories of child abuse and neglect, with neglect being the leading cause of child abuse. There are various risk factors and indicators that indicate whether a child may be a victim of abuse and neglect. You're responsible for knowing the procedures for reporting child abuse and neglect, and being aware of community programs that have training available for employees, children, and parents. This training is not just because it's required. It's also because it's a good idea. Thank you.